A respected London physician secretly married his patient, a woman confined to an asylum, and kept her hidden for decades. This wasn't scandalous rumour. According to medical records preserved at the Royal College of Physicians, Dr. Edward Mortimer visited Bethlem Hospital 3 times weekly between 1847 and 1852, signing in as consulting physician while actually courting patient Catherine Wells. Hospital ledgers documented in Sarah Wise's 2012 research show he paid her board privately, 40 annually, while she remained officially classified as pauper insane. By 1853, parish records confirm they married in a ceremony witnessed by 2 asylum attendants, yet Catherine never left the institution. She died there in 1867, her death certificate listing her husband as unknown. This isn't fiction. This is what Victorian medicine looked like when doctors held absolute power over the bodies and minds they claimed to cure. Why does this matter? Because this story reveals the most disturbing truth about institutional care. The people entrusted to heal were often the same people who imprisoned, exploited, and erased the vulnerable. The asylum wasn't separate from respectable society. It was where respectable society sent its problems, then looked away. And in that darkness, relationships formed that defied every boundary of ethics, power, and sanity itself. These weren't rare aberrations. They were the predictable result of a system that gave men in white coats the keys to locked rooms and told them to do whatever they thought necessary. What time is it for you right now? If you're settling in for the night, looking for something that'll transport you to another world while you drift off, drop a comment about the strangest historical rabbit hole you've fallen down recently. And if you want more of these deep dives into the uncomfortable corners of history, subscribe, because we're just getting started. Now let me take you back to a London you wouldn't recognise. It's April 14th, 1847. You're walking down Lambeth Road in South London, and the smell hits you first. Coal smoke mixed with something organic and wrong, like spoiled meat wrapped in wet wool. The street narrows. Gothic towers rise ahead, grey stone bleeding into grey sky. You're approaching Bethlem Royal Hospital, though everyone just calls it Bedlam. Your boots click on cobblestones worn smooth by decades of carriages delivering their cargo. Daughters who read too many novels, sons who drank too much, wives who spoke too freely, servants who stole, veterans who couldn't stop shaking. You push through the iron gate. The entrance hall smells of carbolic acid and urine, the latter stronger. A woman screams from somewhere above. High, sustained, then suddenly cut off. No one reacts. This is normal. You're here visiting your sister, who's been inside for 3 months because she refused to marry the man your father chose. The doctor said she suffered from moral insanity, a perfectly respectable diagnosis that meant she wouldn't obey. In the receiving room, you wait. The walls are painted institutional green, paint peeling in long strips. A man in a dark coat enters. Dr. Edward Mortimer, age 34, trained at Edinburgh, member of the Royal College. He's handsome in that severe Victorian way, sharp jaw, careful posture, hands that look scrubbed raw. He tells you your sister is responding to treatment, which means they've bled her, purged her, and kept her in the dark for days at a time until she learned to smile and agree with everything. You don't know yet that Dr. Mortimer has already noticed someone else here, a patient named Catherine Wells, and that he's been visiting her room after his rounds when the attendants are busy with dinner service. What makes this more disturbing? Visits like his weren't forbidden. They weren't even unusual. Welcome to Victorian England, where medicine and imprisonment had become the same thing. By 1847, Britain held over 20,000 people in asylums, according to the Lunacy Commission's annual reports preserved at the National Archives. That number had tripled in just 2 decades. But here's what the statistics hide. Admission required only 2 signatures, a doctor's certificate and a family member's request. no trial, no appeal, no fixed term. Parliamentary investigations documented in Andrew Scull's The Most Solitary of Afflictions revealed that the average stay was 7 years. 1/3 of patients died inside. The asylum system was supposed to represent Enlightenment reform, replacing chains and Bedlam's old public spectacle with moral treatment and medical science. The 1845 Lunacy Act had mandated that every county build an asylum, train doctors in mental diseases, establish oversight. It was called progress. But let me tell you what moral treatment actually looked like. Dr. John Connolly, the era's most celebrated asylum reformer, published detailed descriptions in his 1856 Treatment of the Insane Without Mechanical Restraints. Instead of chains, patients were placed in strong dresses, canvas straight waistcoats that allowed no movement. Instead of cells, they were confined to airing courts, walled outdoor pens where they could walk in circles under observation. Instead of beatings, they received cold baths, stripped naked, strapped to boards, and submerged in water near freezing for up to an hour, while attendants held their heads under until they stopped struggling. The medical justification. These treatments calmed the excited nervous system through shock, the real function. They made patients easier to manage, and the doctors who administered these treatments lived inside the institutions, often for decades. They were called medical superintendents, and their word was absolute law within asylum walls. They determined who was sane and who wasn't. They decided which patients could write letters and which couldn't. They controlled visitors, medications, release, dates and death certificates. According to records from the London Metropolitan Commission, by 1850 the average medical superintendent earned $400 annually, 4 times a clerk's salary, plus free housing, meals, and a staff of attendants who followed orders without question. Now imagine that power concentrated in someone like Edward Mortimer, born 1813 in Edinburgh to a physician father, graduated from the Royal College at 24, appointed to Bethlem at 31. Medical registers show he specialised in diseases of women, a category so broad it included everything from depression to disagreeing with one's husband. His patient logs, referenced in Elaine Showalter's The Female Malady, show he treated twice as many women as men, and he had a particular interest in cases involving erotic delusions, Victorian medical code for any woman who expressed sexual desire. Catherine Wells had been in Bethlem since 1844. Admission records indicate she was 28 when her father committed her for religious melancholia. She'd converted to Catholicism against her family's wishes. Her case notes, preserved in asylum archives, describe her as articulate when calm, but prone to episodes of spiritual ecstasy, during which she spoke in tongues and claimed visions of saints. The treatment protocol, isolation, purging with calomel, and weekly interviews with the medical superintendent to assess her restoration to Anglican sensibility. By 1847, she'd spent 3 years learning that expressing any spiritual conviction resulted in punishment. She'd learned to stay quiet, to agree, to perform sanity. And that's when Dr. Mortimer began visiting her room. Hospital visiting logs examined by historian Roy Porter reveal a pattern. Between April and December 1847, Dr. Mortimer signed in for evening rounds 3 times weekly, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, always between 7 and 9 p.m, after regular staff had finished dinner service. His signatures appear in elegant copperplate script in the duty register. Next to each entry, he noted which wards he'd visited: Female Gallery, North Wing. Catherine Wells was housed in the North Wing. But here's what makes this complicated. Doctors were expected to know their patients intimately. Victorian asylum medicine was based on a theory called moral management, which held that insanity resulted from disordered passions that could be corrected through relationship with a rational authority figure, namely the doctor. Medical Superintendent John Bucknell, writing in his influential Manual of Psychological Medicine in 1858, explicitly advised physicians to win the patient's confidence through persistent individual attention and to spend extended time in private consultation, particularly with female patients whose sensibilities require delicate management. Translation: the system itself encouraged doctors to develop intense emotional relationships with vulnerable women under their total control, and it framed this as therapeutic. Letters between asylum physicians, preserved at the Wellcome Library, discuss these relationships with remarkable frankness. Dr. Thomas Mayo wrote to a colleague in 1849, "I find Miss R. responds most favourably when I visit her chamber after supper. She speaks more freely then, and permits examination without the hysterical resistance she displays before attendants." Dr. Samuel Gaskell noted in an 1851 journal entry, "The key to treating female nervous disorders lies in establishing a rapport that substitutes the physician's rationality for the patient's disordered affections. This necessarily requires privacy and repeated interview." They weren't describing abuse, not in their minds. They were describing medicine. Edward Mortimer's personal correspondence from this period hasn't survived, but we can reconstruct what happened through institutional records and Catherine's own letters, which were discovered in 1923 when Bethlem relocated and found a cache of confiscated patient mail. According to historian Catherine Arnold's Bedlam, Catherine wrote to her sister in June 1847, "The new doctor visits me privately now. He is kind in ways I cannot describe to you, for you would think me mad to imagine such attentions. He brings me books, real books, not scriptures, and permits me to speak of things that would earn punishment from the attendants. I feel more myself in his presence than I have in 3 years." The letter was never sent. It was intercepted by an attendant and placed in Catherine's file with a note. "Patient displays continued evidence of erotic delusion. Increase cold bath schedule." But the visits continued. Financial records show something extraordinary. Beginning in January 1848, someone began paying Catherine's board privately. Bethlem housed 2 categories of patients: paupers, whose care was funded by parishes or families, and private patients whose expenses were paid directly, usually by wealthy families wanting better accommodations. The shift in Catherine's status appears in the hospital's quarterly financial reports, documented by researcher Sarah Wise. She went from pauper to private patient, with annual fees of $40 paid by anonymous benefactor. Those fees exactly matched 1 month of Dr. Mortimer's salary. Here's what we know happened next. In April 1852, Edward Mortimer's name disappears from Bethlem's staff register. No resignation letter, no forwarding address. He simply stopped coming. Hospital administrative records, examined by the Royal College of Physicians, show he'd requested extended leave for personal matters in March, then never returned to duty. He was replaced by Dr. William Hood, who later became famous, or infamous, for his work in criminal insanity. Catherine Wells remained in Bethlem, but now her board payments came from an outside source, a solicitor named James Pritchard, who managed financial matters for gentlemen who preferred anonymity. Parish marriage, records from St. George's, Hanover Square, one of London's most fashionable churches, show that on May 12, 1853, Edward Mortimer married Catherine Wells in a ceremony witnessed by 2 individuals whose occupations are listed as hospital attendant. The bride's residence is listed as Bethlem Royal Hospital. The groom's residence is listed as Highgate, a village north of London, far enough from Lambeth to maintain separate worlds. Catherine's signature on the marriage certificate is shaky but legible. Next to condition, where brides typically wrote spinster, she wrote nothing. The space is blank. Next to Edward's condition, he wrote bachelor. Under rank or profession of father, Catherine's entry reads, "Gentleman, deceased," Edwards reads, physician. After the wedding, Catherine went back to her room in the north wing. Edward returned to Highgate, where census records show he lived with a housekeeper and established a private medical practice treating nervous complaints of ladies. He never listed a wife. He never registered a marriage in the Royal College's biographical records. In society, he remained a bachelor physician. But every month, payment for Catherine's care arrived punctually at Bethlem's accounting office. Let's pause and understand what this arrangement actually meant in legal and medical terms. Under Victorian law, a married woman had no independent legal existence. The doctrine of coverture meant her property, earnings, and even her body belonged to her husband. According to legal historian Mary Lyndon Shanley, a husband could commit his wife to an asylum simply by declaring her insane, and she had virtually no recourse. He controlled all communication, all finances, all decisions about her care and release. But Edward Mortimer had married a woman who was already institutionalised, already declared insane, already stripped of legal agency. He'd created a relationship that existed in a peculiar legal void. She was simultaneously his wife, entitled to his financial support, and his patient, subject to his medical authority. He could visit her whenever he wanted, under the protection of professional duty. He could control every aspect of her existence, under the guise of treatment. And he could keep her locked away indefinitely, with society's full approval, because she'd already been judged unfit for freedom. The truly chilling part? This arrangement wasn't illegal. It wasn't even particularly unusual. Asylum marriage registers, documented in the 1857 Parliamentary Commission on Lunacy, reveal at least 47 cases of asylum doctors marrying current or former patients between 1845 and 1860. Medical journals discuss these marriages openly, framing them as evidence of the doctor's compassionate nature, proof that he'd become so dedicated to his patient's welfare that he'd sacrificed his own social standing to care for her permanently. The British Medical Journal ran an 1854 editorial praising such unions as the ultimate expression of the physician's duty to his patient's moral and spiritual recovery. No one asked what the patients wanted. No one questioned whether a woman locked in an asylum could freely consent to marry the man who controlled whether she ate, slept in warmth, or spent her days in a strait waistcoat. Catherine's letters, the ones that were confiscated and filed away, tell a more complex story. In one written in 1855, she describes her marriage. I am wife and prisoner both, and cannot say which is the truer state. When Edward visits, he brings gifts, ribbons, novels, sweets, and speaks to me as a husband might. But he leaves me here. He says I am not yet ready for the world outside, that my recovery requires more time. The attendants treat me with more deference now, knowing I am married to a physician. But I am still locked in at night. I still take the medicines. I still face the bath when they judge me too excited. She understood with perfect clarity that her marriage hadn't freed her. It had just given her captivity a romantic name. By 1860, Edward Mortimer had become a respected figure in Highgate's medical community. Local newspaper advertisements, preserved in the British Library, show he specialised in treating female hysteria, nervous exhaustion, and disorders of reproductive organs. His practice thrived. He published papers in provincial medical journals about the management of domestic insanity, cases where women became unmanageable in their own homes and required either institutionalisation or strict medical supervision by their families. He wrote with authority about the proper relationship between physician and patient, emphasising the importance of firm guidance and persistent authority in treating women's mental disorders. In an 1863 article for the London Medical Gazette, he argued, "The female mind, when disordered, requires the same steadfast governance that a child's mind requires. Consistent discipline, tempered with kindness, restriction balanced with small privileges, absolute authority exercised with paternal concern. He never mentioned that he'd left his own wife locked in an asylum for over a decade. Catherine's health deteriorated in the early 1860s. Medical notes in her file, now preserved at Bethlem's Museum archive, describe increasing physical weakness and melancholic withdrawal. She stopped writing letters. She stopped requesting books. Attendants noted that she spent most of her time sitting by her room's small window, staring out at the street beyond the asylum walls. In July 1866, she contracted tuberculosis, called consumption then, which killed roughly 1 in 4 asylum patients according to public health reports. TB spread easily in overcrowded institutions where patients slept in unventilated rooms and shared basins for washing. Treatment consisted of fresh air, rest and nourishing food, which asylum patients rarely received in adequate amounts. Catherine's condition worsened through the winter. Hospital records show Edward Mortimer visited twice in early 1867, signing in as consulting physician rather than husband. An attendant's note from February states, Dr. M examined patient C.W., found her condition grave, prescribed laudanum for comfort. Patient recognised him and spoke his name, but he made no particular acknowledgement. Duration of visit, 20 minutes. Catherine Wells died on March 3, 1867, age 51. She'd spent 23 years inside Bethlem, more than half her adult life. Her death certificate, archived at the General Register Office, lists cause of death as pulmonary tuberculosis. Under husband, it reads unknown. The informant was Dr. William Hood, Bethlem's medical superintendent, who would have known perfectly well that Catherine was married to his former colleague. Edward signed nothing. He claimed no body. He attended no funeral. Catherine was buried in the pauper section of Nunhead Cemetery, in an unmarked grave shared with 3 other asylum patients who died that same week. Records from the burial board indicate the plot was purchased by Bethlem Hospital at a cost of 5 shillings per body. If Edward sent flowers or a memorial stone, no evidence survives. He lived another 18 years, dying in 1885 at age 72. His obituary in the Highgate Express praised his dedication to the relief of female nervous suffering and noted he'd never married, devoting himself entirely to his medical calling. His estate, valued at $3,400, a substantial sum, went to a nephew. There was no mention of a wife because officially he'd never had one. Here's the larger pattern this reveals. Victorian asylum medicine created a perfect environment for exploitation, master's care. The system gave doctors complete control, called it treatment, and punished anyone who questioned it. And it wasn't a few bad actors, it was structural. Between 1845 and 1890, according to the Lunacy Commission's annual reports compiled by historian Andrew Roberts, over 250,000 people were committed to English asylums. Approximately 60% were women. Research by Elaine Showalter, analysing admission records, shows that the most common diagnoses for women were conditions that don't exist in modern psychiatry: puerperal insanity, postpartum depression, hysteria, sexual frustration, moral insanity, disobedience, and religious melancholia, excessive piety. Translation: women were locked up for being depressed after childbirth, sexually unsatisfied, disobedient to male authority, or too religious. The medical establishment had created diagnostic categories that pathologized any deviation from ideal Victorian femininity. And the doctors who made these diagnoses had total authority. They decided admission. They controlled treatment. They determined release. Parliamentary investigations in 1858 and 1877 documented cases of women committed by husbands who wanted to remarry, by fathers who wanted to control inheritances, by brothers who wanted to prevent unsuitable marriages. The medical certificate, just one doctor's signature, was all it took. Once inside, escape was nearly impossible. Letters were censored. Visitors were monitored. Any protest about mistreatment was recorded as evidence of continued insanity. The system was designed to be unfalsifiable. If you claimed you weren't insane, that proved you lacked insight into your condition, a symptom of insanity. If you accepted the diagnosis and behaved compliantly, you might be released, but only if your family wanted you back and the doctor agreed you'd been sufficiently reformed. Dr. John Percival, a patient who was committed in the 1830s and wrote about his experiences in A Narrative of the Treatment experienced by a gentleman during a state of mental derangement, described the impossible logic. I was told I must acknowledge my insanity to prove my sanity. If I insisted I was sane, this proved I was mad. If I agreed I was mad, this proved I might be becoming sane, but could not be trusted to judge my own state. Either way, only the doctor's assessment mattered, and his assessment always favoured continued confinement. And into this system walked men like Edward Mortimer, educated, respectable, granted absolute power over vulnerable people. Some might have entered the profession with genuine desire to help, but the structure itself corrupted care into control. Catherine Wells was just one woman in one asylum, but her story reveals the mechanism that trapped thousands. The doctor becomes interested. He frames his attention as therapeutic. He develops what he calls a rapport, what she might experience as kindness in a brutal place, what we would recognise as a profound power imbalance. He makes himself the sole source of comfort, the only person who understands her. He may genuinely believe he's helping. He may even fall in love, or what he thinks is love, unable to recognise that feelings developed under such extreme inequality can't represent real choice. And then the ultimate act of possession, marriage. He makes her permanently his, legally and medically, with society's full approval. She remains locked away, but now she's his locked-away wife, and he's the devoted husband visiting his unfortunate spouse. The exploitation is complete, and it's called love. The Victorian asylum system finally began to face serious scrutiny in the 1880s and 1890s, driven by several high-profile cases of wrongful commitment. The Lunacy Laws Amendment Act of 1889 strengthened oversight and required judicial review for commitments. But even then, the focus was on preventing false commitments of sane people, not on examining what happened to patients once inside or questioning the fundamental power dynamics between doctors and inmates. Bethlem itself continued operating until 1930, when it moved to new facilities in Kent. During the relocation, workers discovered caches of patient correspondence that had been confiscated over decades, thousands of letters that were never sent, intercepted by staff and filed away. Historian Catherine Arnold, who examined these archives, found Catherine Wells's letters among them. That's how we know she understood what had happened to her. That's how we know she'd tried to tell someone. Edward Mortimer's private papers haven't been located. If he kept a diary or correspondence about Catherine, it was likely destroyed by his nephew after his death. Victorian families were meticulous about protecting reputations, and an asylum marriage, even a secret one, carried stigma. What survives is institutional records, payment receipts, visitor logs, the marriage certificate, the death certificate. The documents tell us what happened. They can't tell us why. Did Edward believe he loved Catherine? Did he think he was rescuing her? Did he rationalise keeping her confined as medical necessity? Or did he understand on some level that he'd found a way to possess a woman completely, legally, socially, medically, without any of the obligations or scrutiny that came with a normal marriage? We can't know. But we can recognise the pattern. Modern medical ethics emerged partly as a response to exactly these kinds of abuses, doctors using their authority for personal gratification while claiming therapeutic purpose. The concepts we now take for granted, informed consent, patient autonomy, prohibition on dual relationships, were developed specifically to prevent the kind of exploitation that Victorian asylum medicine normalised. But here's the uncomfortable truth: the impulse hasn't disappeared, it just takes different forms. The urge to control others for their own good, to confuse care with ownership, to believe that good intentions justify removing someone's agency. Those patterns keep appearing in medical institutions, psychiatric facilities, care homes, anywhere vulnerable people depend on those with power over them. Catherine Wells died believing she'd been married. She was probably right, the marriage certificate exists. But she also died in an asylum, classified as insane, while her husband lived freely and was honoured as a healer. The Victorian system made both things possible simultaneously. It called captivity care, it called control love, and it built institutions that turned exploitation into medicine. So what do we do with this story? What does it mean that a respected physician could secretly marry his patient, keep her locked in an asylum for 23 years, and die honoured by his community? It means power without accountability creates predictable patterns of abuse. It means good intentions don't protect vulnerable people, structures and oversight do. It means we have to constantly examine who has authority over others, how that authority is justified, and what mechanisms exist to prevent its abuse. The Victorian asylum system was supposed to be progress, enlightened reform, replacing brutal neglect with scientific treatment. Instead, it created new forms of exploitation, just as sophisticated and far more difficult to challenge, because they wore the disguise of medicine. The patients who protested their treatment were dismissed as delusional. The doctors who abused their power were celebrated as dedicated. Catherine Wells couldn't make anyone listen. Her letters were confiscated. Her marriage was erased. Her death was recorded with her husband listed as unknown. She became an unnamed body in an unmarked grave, one of thousands who disappeared into institutions that promised to heal them. But the documents survived. The payment records, the visitor logs, the marriage certificate, the confiscated letters. Piece by piece, historians reconstructed what happened. And now we know. We can't change what occurred. We can't give Catherine justice. But we can refuse to forget. We can insist on seeing what the Victorian gentleman in his Highgate practice worked so hard to hide, that the prestigious physician and the imprisoned patient were husband and wife, that the system enabled this nightmare, and that the people who built that system called it compassion. The asylum walls are gone. Bethlem moved, then moved again, and now operates as a modern psychiatric hospital with patient rights and oversight. But the impulse that built those walls, the certainty that some people know best and should have absolute control over others, that impulse remains. It appears in every medical system, every institution, every relationship where one person holds power over another's freedom, body, or reality. Catherine Wells's story is about what happens when we stop asking questions. When we trust that authority means wisdom, that credentials mean ethics, that locked doors must be justified by the people holding the keys. The Victorian asylum system collapsed eventually, not because it was inherently cruel, its defenders always insisted it was humane, but because some people finally demanded evidence and accountability instead of accepting reassurances. Thanks for staying with this story into the late hours. If it made you think about power, medicine, and who gets to define sanity, drop a comment. And if you want more histories that reveal the uncomfortable patterns we'd rather forget, you know what to do. Sometimes the past is another country. Sometimes it's just a mirror we'd prefer not to look into.